Reykjavik. So really pleased to see you all, and really happy to see the turnout for this event. For those of you that aren't familiar, this webinar series is one that's been co-hosted between Iceland's embassy in Canada and Canada's embassy in Iceland for quite a few years now, and with all different variations of topics. So we hope that you tune in for future events. But of course, today we are holding this particular webinar, which is focused on Iceland and Canada and cooperation in World War I and World War II, in the spirit of Remembrance Day. And it should be a really interesting topic. We have two scholars, two PhD students who are here with us, one Canadian, one Icelandic, and I'll introduce them in a moment. But there's actually very little published on this particular topic. I myself did not know about this cooperation, and I held myself from looking things up because I knew we'd have two experts on the line today. So we will have our two speakers. We'll start and hang on, but I'll just say a few more things, but just so we know who we're going to hear from. We have Madison Herget-Schmidt, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Manitoba and who is Canadian. And then we'll hear from Karen Lilja Loftsdóttir, who is also a PhD candidate at Queen's University, but who is Icelandic. Moderating our session today will be Dr. Jeff Noakes, who is the historian of the Second World War at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. So he'll moderate the session and then facilitate a question and answer exchange with the audience. The session will be recorded, so sharing that for your awareness. And before I turn it over to Madison, I've got two final points. The first is that we would also like to take an opportunity to honor the memory and work of Dr. Tim Cook, who I'm sure many of you know, who was the chief historian and director of research at the Canadian War Museum, who passed away sadly on October 25th of this year. He'd been at the War Museum since 2002, authored 19 books, and was the recipient of multiple awards. So we wanted to take this opportunity to remember him as well. And I also wanted to take the opportunity to honor Ambassador Hlynur Gudjonsson. Some of you might not know that this will be his last webinar. He is finishing his tenure in Canada. And I just wanted to thank him for his excellent partnership and collaboration over the years that he's been in Canada. This webinar series was started under him, as well as multiple other great initiatives. He's been such an advocate for the Canada-Iceland bilateral relationship, and we will miss him in his role. So thank you, Hlynur, for everything you've done in your service. So with that, I will turn over to Madison to kick us off.
Good morning, everyone. My presentation is called Icelandic Canadians in the First World War, Enlistment and Service. Between 1914 and 1918, 1,260 Icelanders, Icelandic Canadians, and Icelandic Americans enlisted or were conscripted into the Canadian Expeditionary Force. The majority of enlistees from 1914 and early to mid-1915 were from Winnipeg, and a small number of men also enlisted from the cities of Calgary and Vancouver. As 1915 progressed, more Icelanders from rural areas began enlisting as battalions started to recruit men from towns in rural Manitoba and Saskatchewan. Some early enlistees were also already members of the militia, having served during the South African War between 1899 and 1902. Enlistees in 1915 and 1916 largely enlisted in the 108th and 223rd Battalions. However, there were 88 battalions with small Icelandic contingents. The Military Service Act became law on the 29th of August 1917 and made military service a legal requirement for men between the ages of 20 and 45 unless an individual was exempted from service on compassionate grounds, such as due to familial or employment obligations. 56% of the Icelanders who joined the Canadian military in 1917 were conscripts, representing 75 out of the 132 Icelanders who joined that year. By 1918, this number had risen to 87%, with 402 out of 460 Icelanders who joined being conscripted. 11 more men had voluntarily enlisted in 1915 and 1916 and were rejected to later be conscripted in 1917 or 1918. There were several battalions established in Manitoba that accounted for large numbers of Icelanders enlisting in the Canadian military during the First World War. The first of these is the 108th Battalion. This battalion had the highest percentage of Icelanders enlisted of any battalion in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, due in part to the fact that its recruitment occurred in the Interlake region of Manitoba, which included Selkirk, Gimli, Arberg, Riverton, and other small communities and townships with large Icelandic populations. Icelanders in the battalion included Private Archibald Jón Poulsen, who would later serve at the Battle of Vimy Ridge. It recruited members from rural Manitoba and Winnipeg, with its primary barracks being at the Red Feather Farm in Selkirk, Manitoba, roughly 30 minutes north of Winnipeg. It was because of their residency at the Red Feather Farm that the battalion cap badge was given its emblematic rooster. The battalion was sent overseas on the 18th of September 1916 and was later dissolved in June 1917. Its members were reassigned to larger overseas battalions that were then sent to France. The establishment of the 223rd Battalion was significant for the Scandinavian community because it was one of only 39 specialty battalions established during the war. It was created on the 1st of March 1916 and recruited members from Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia. The 223rd Battalion had a large Icelandic contingent, with 220 out of 524 men who went overseas, declaring Icelandic heritage in their attestation papers. The battalion's leadership was also predominantly Icelandic, with 11 out of 16 members of the officer class being Icelandic, including commanding officer Hannes Marino Hannesson. These men were between the ages of 23 and 31 and included physicians, students, merchants, real estate brokers, lawyers, and school administrators. 8 underage soldiers also enlisted in the 223rd Battalion, the youngest of which was a 13-year-old from Lundar, Manitoba. He enlisted on the 31st of July 1916 and was discharged as unfit to serve due to his age on the 3rd of April 1917, when he was undergoing final medical screening prior to deployment. The majority of the members of the battalion were born in Canada or Iceland. However, a small number came north from the United States or from England to enlist. Beginning in March 1916, members of the 223rd Battalion trained at Camp Hughes, a military training facility west of Portage la Prairie, Manitoba. This included basic training as well as the handling and operation of machine gunning equipment. The facility also featured a 10-kilometer trench system, which was used for trench warfare training. The battalion established its own regimental magazine, which they called the 223rd Sniper. It was edited by Lieutenant Christian Austman, and its publication started in spring 1916 and continued until 1917, when it was discontinued due to the battalion's deployment to England. One of the most notable developments within the 223rd Battalion was the establishment of its hockey team. The Winnipeg Falcons hockey team was established in 1911 due to the fact that Icelanders were excluded from men's hockey in Winnipeg at the time. In 1916, when recruitment for the 223rd Battalion began, every member of the Falcons enlisted. One battalion member kept an extensive journal documenting the team's practices and games, including the teams they played against and the scores of the games. The success of the hockey team was also extensively covered in newspapers such as the Winnipeg Tribune, the Winnipeg Free Press, and local newspapers from communities that 223rd Battalion members lived in. 2 members of the Falcons died during the war, but the rest returned to Canada, re-establishing the team in 1919. And on the 26th of April 1920, the Falcons represented Canada in the Olympic gold medal game against Sweden, bringing home Canada's first Olympic gold medal in ice hockey. The following are excerpts from letters and war diaries from 3 Icelanders who served in the First World War in various capacities. They are arranged chronologically and demonstrate how various individuals felt about their military service. First is Private Archibald Jon Poulsen, who enlisted on the 16th of February 1916 in the 108th Battalion. In February 1917, he was sent to France as a member of the 2nd Canadian Machine Gun Company, where he served at the Battle of Vimy Ridge. In April 1917, he was injured and admitted to hospital, and he received treatment until September 1917 when he succumbed to his injuries due to contracting tetanus post-amputation of his left arm. Secondly is Dr. Stein Olafur Thompson, who was a medical student studying at the University of Manitoba when the First World War began. He was recruited into the 11th Field Ambulance Battalion and treated patients at the Battle of the Somme, the Battle of Vimy Ridge, and the Battle of Passchendaele, where he was wounded. After the war, he completed his medical degree and worked as a physician in Riverton, Manitoba, beginning in 1922. Later, he became involved in politics, serving as a member of the Manitoba legislature from 1945 to 1958. Finally is nursing sister Inga Johnson, who enlisted in the Canadian Army Medical Corps at the age of 34 in August 1916. She first worked at a hospital in Shorncliffe, England, and was later transferred to a field hospital in France. On the 28th of July, 1917, she was promoted to sister in charge of a casualty clearing station in France, and it was here that she started to write poetry, reflecting the work of herself and her fellow nursing sisters. Private Archibald Jon Poulsen wrote many letters to his family while he was en route to England. Some, such as this one and the ones that followed, expressed pride in military service, optimism for what the future in France held, and the anticipation of what he called the adventures to come. He wrote on the 12th of November 1916, "I wouldn't mind being home, but we are fighting for a good cause, and I wouldn't miss it for anything. I would not like to be sitting at home knowing that I had not tried to do my bit for my country, unlike some of the boys back there. You must not think for a moment that I regret that I joined the army." Dr. Stein Olafur Thompson began writing his journal in May 1916 and reflected on his experiences training and embarking for England. He also wrote during his first months in France before being separated from his journal at the Battle of the Somme. He wrote retrospectively, reflecting that to leave the Somme was the earnest hope of every soul, and although the rejoicing was not loud or noisy, yet every heart bubbled over with joy. Most of our boys were broken in on the Somme, and their first initiation into the horrors and misery of war was such as they will never forget. Our boys left that butcher ground a chastened and humbled bunch. Dr. Thompson's journal contains a detailed account of his activities during the Battle of the Somme, filling in gaps from November 1916, including the soldiers he treated, the sites of battle he witnessed, and along with his medical team. Dr. Thompson's recollections of the Somme sharply contrast the optimistic outlook shared by Private Poulsen a few weeks later when he wrote to his mother before leaving for France with the machine gun company. His last letter from the 6th of February 1917 concluded as follows: "I am in good health and am looking forward to seeing France, whatever it may have in store for me." On the 14th of February, when Poulsen wrote again, it was clear that he'd began to understand the realities of serving in the war. He wrote to his mother that, quote, "I am prepared to die at any time that the Lord wills it. I firmly believe it will be heaven for me when I die. I don't think anyone can say that I haven't been a pretty good boy these 21 years of my life." Poulsen wrote many more letters to his mother after he was injured and hospitalized. The tone taken in his writing changed drastically in this time, and he began to express concern and worry for his cousin Frank, who would also enlist in the army. He explained to his mother on the 7th of May 1917 that "I told Frank to stay away from France as long as he could, and not be too anxious to get there. There is a saying amongst some of the boys in the trenches that it's better to be a living coward than a dead hero." His cousin, Frank Mulvey Poulsen, would survive the war. On the front lines in France, Dr. Thompson continued to write in his journal of his experiences treating wounded soldiers and serving as a stretcher bearer. He wrote that our 11 months in France have made veterans out of us. We can now look on death as a natural and commonplace incident. The fear of death has long since departed, but the fear of pain still remains as before. We have all become fatalists. 2 months after this journal entry was written on the 25th of July, 1917, Dr. Thompson was wounded at Passchendaele and was sent to recover in England. After recovering, he continued to work in the Shorncliffe Hospital in England before returning to Canada and establishing his own medical practice. Nursing sister Inga Johnson maintained a small autograph book in which she and her fellow nursing sisters wrote letters, poems, journal entries, and comics reflecting their experiences working in hospitals in England and France and on the front lines in the casualty clearing stations. Johnson wrote the following on the 26th of November, 1917, reflecting her thoughts on her work. Their pleasant homes they left, and sailed where duty led. Fair France was steeped in blood, Belgium bereft of all her unconquerable souls. And now upon the heated brow our sisters lay their tender woman's hands and drive to snatch from death his young untimely prey. The greatest monument will be theirs, to live enshrined in each Canadian soldier's heart. Icelanders served in the Canadian Expeditionary Force and the Canadian Army Medical Corps, and were present during every major battle of the First World War. They made invaluable contributions to the war effort through their work as soldiers, nurses, and doctors. Icelanders from across Canada and the United States, as well as Iceland and England, enlisted in the military, and some Icelanders traveled from Iceland to Canada in order to enlist and serve. Icelandic involvement in the war is unique due to the fact that Iceland did not, and still today does not, have an established military of its own. Therefore, Icelanders served because it was a Canadian duty to serve, not because it was an Icelandic one. In their service to Canada, 143 soldiers and one nursing sister paid the ultimate sacrifice, lest we forget them and all other Icelanders who served in the Canadian forces. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm the second speaker today. Thank you so much for having me and for Ambassador Guðjónsson and Ambassador Hill for organizing this event. My name is Karen Lilja Loftsdóttir. I am a PhD candidate at the Department of History at Queen's University in Kingston, but I'm also from Iceland and I'm studying at Queen's as an international student. I'm currently in my 5th year of the PhD, so I'm fairly close to finishing. So hopefully by the end of next year, I can say that I'm fully done. The topic of my dissertation is the social and cultural aspect of the Canadian part in the Allied occupation of Iceland during the Second World War. So I'm asking questions like, what was it like for Canadians that were stationed in Iceland during the war? What were their interactions with Icelanders like, and what did they do in their free time? Trying to change my slide. How do I do that? I'm running into some difficulties here. I'm trying to change my slide and I don't know how to do that. So
I did mine a little bit differently. I had mine upload into Teams.
Oh, okay.
And I did it that way.
Okay.
You should just be able to hit the right key, the right arrow. That should get you through.
No, it just doesn't work. Oh.
Hmm.
Okay. Jeff, do you have a copy of the slides? Jeff? Okay, I'm just gonna stop sharing.
Karen, if you could email me a copy, this is Per, a copy of the slides,
yeah,
then I'll try to bring
okay.
them up.
I sent them to Jeff already. Okay, let's see.
Okay, I should have those now.
Yeah. Okay. Just give it a second. Okay. Is anything happening? Oh, yeah, I don't.
Karen, I'll bring these up. Let me just bring them up now.
Yeah.
Just 1 second.
Thank you. Yay. You go to the second slide, please.
Okay.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Yeah, so there are two phases in Canada's part in the occupation of Iceland. Firstly, there was a Z Force, which was an army battalion made up from parts of different Canadian battalions, and most of the men in Z Force were stationed in Iceland from July to October 1940, but some personnel stayed on with the British forces until April 1941. Secondly, there was 162 Squadron, which was a squadron within the Royal Canadian Air Force that was stationed in Iceland from January 1944 to the end of the war in 45 and a little bit after that. So what I'm doing is comparing these two phases in the occupation and trying to see how the interactions with Icelanders evolved from 1940 to 45. Only in the last 10 years, as Ambassador Hill mentioned, have historians become more aware of this kind of like missing piece in the narrative of the occupation of Iceland, which is Canada's involvement. Next slide, please. But before we get into the occupation, it's kind of necessary to set the scene of what Reykjavik, Iceland was like in the 1930s and 1940s. By European standards in the 1930s, Iceland was considered one of the poorest countries in Europe. Iceland was still dealing with the aftermath of the Depression from 1929. Dirt roads still paved most of Reykjavik, and indoor washrooms and bathrooms were considered a luxury. And there was extreme food, clothing, and housing shortage. In fact, to many travelers in the early 20th century, Reykjavik didn't seem like much of a city at all compared to cities on the European mainland, with Reykjavik having the population of 38,000 people before the occupation began. But Iceland was under Danish monarchy in 1940, but had become a sovereign state in 1918. That meant that the Icelandic government controlled all its domestic affairs and most of its foreign affairs by 1940. When Iceland became a sovereign state in 1918, the Icelandic government declared ævarandi hlutleysi, or everlasting neutrality, meaning that they created this policy of not wishing to partake in any future military operations or alliances. That sure went well. But with the sudden arrival of the British forces in May 1940, however, Icelanders were forced to abandon this policy. Some Icelanders saw it as a foreign war and a foreign army being thrust upon them, changing their society and livelihoods, which is ultimately what happened. And as a direct result of the occupation, there was significant boom in Icelandic economic growth, infrastructure, and urbanization. Next slide, please. But the main reason why Iceland was considered so important in the war, and more specifically in the Battle of the Atlantic, was because it sat along all the main convoy routes between Britain and North America, which meant that every time goods were transported from US or Canada to Britain or mainland Europe, ships almost always sailed through or very close to Icelandic territorial waters, as you can see on the photo on the slide. Since Iceland declared neutrality in the war, and Icelanders wished very much to avoid becoming involved in the conflict. So when British ships suddenly arrived one May morning, many Icelanders were not very happy about that. Many voiced their displeasure in the media in the first days of the occupation, and also worried about how the occupation would affect Icelandic society, with thousands of soldiers being stationed on an island of only around 121,000 people at the time. Next slide, please. There we go. The British hastily decided to occupy Iceland in May 1940, and after some debate, the Canadians agreed to send additional forces to aid in garrisoning the island and protecting it from German invasion. The Canadians, just like the British, were ill-prepared and poorly trained for the occupation. The three partial battalions that Z Force was made up of were the Royal Regiment of Canada, the Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa, and Les Fusiliers Mont-Royal. And there were only about 2,500 men in total in Z Force, which maybe explains why the Canadians flew pretty far under the radar when it comes to the narrative of the occupation. But many soldiers were rather bitter about being stationed in Iceland during the war. Instead of fighting the Germans like they had been expecting, they were sent to a small island in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean where there was like nothing for them to do except garrison duty and construction work. Next slide, please. Moreover, the conditions of the Canadian soldiers in Iceland in 1940 were not ideal. Most of the soldiers slept in tents for most of their time in Iceland, which you can imagine sounds horrible if you've ever been there. They did not get any raincoats until the fall, but it rained almost all of the days that Z Force was stationed in Iceland, which means that they were just not equipped for the weather conditions. The clothes were often very damp, and thus diseases and flus were very common. Meanwhile, the officers of Z Force had lodgings at Hotel Borg, one of the best hotels in Reykjavik, which is still operative today. So we can see that there's a huge difference in just the quality of life between the officers and soldiers. Next slide, please. Sexually transmitted infections were also common within Z Force, and sometimes there were up to 20% of all recorded illnesses. And this tells us that there was definitely some interaction between the soldiers and the Icelanders, particularly women, but also men, and that the soldiers most likely did not have access to contraceptives, such as the condom, which would have become more accessible over the following years. The men of Z Force mostly interacted with Icelanders outside their military camp, as the locals were not allowed to enter the camp. Some did still enter the camp, but the officers tried to enforce this policy rather strictly. The soldiers of Z Force thus met Icelanders, particularly women, outside their camp at bars and restaurants and guest houses and such. Next slide, please. But in 1941, the United States took over as the main occupying force in Iceland, allowing the British to send the bulk of their men back to Europe. 162 Squadron numbered only around 500 men in total, but it was nonetheless one of the most successful squadrons based in Iceland during the war. Now, 162 Squadron was sent to Iceland in 1944 because the US forces had moved some of their squadrons from Iceland to be stationed elsewhere in Europe. So an extra squadron was needed for anti-submarine warfare in the North Atlantic. And 162 Squadron was, as far as I know, the only Canadian squadron numbered in the 100s that was based overseas during the war. Overseas squadrons were usually numbered 200 or 300 or something. But what made 162 Squadron so successful is that they managed to sink, I think it was up to 5 U-boats, mostly on their own. and one of their members even received the Victoria Cross as well, the most prestigious decoration of the British honor system. Yeah. Okay. The officers of 162 Squadron felt that the sole Canadian military camp in Iceland at the time deserved a more fitting name, so they renamed the camp Camp Maple Leaf. The Canadians fixed the camp up and built both big and small barracks or Nissen huts for social occasions. 162 Squadron surprisingly had a very active social life in Iceland. Movies were shown in the camp theater up to 4 times a week, different films almost every time as well. Furthermore, 162 Squadron hosted approximately 3 parties a week at their camp. They sometimes hosted big parties where hundreds of people were invited, Icelanders included. They had a Halloween party, New Year's Eve party, lavish dinner parties and dances, and much more. But they almost always invited Icelandic women to those parties, or stúlkas, as they called them, which is just a word for a young woman in Icelandic. They would call after them in the street and go like, "Hey, stúlka!" But what is thought to be unusual about 162 Squadron is that they also invited Icelandic men to their parties, which most occupying forces did not do. Next slide, please. But watching movies was not the only entertainment for Canadian airmen in Iceland. As mentioned in connection with Z-Force, many Canadian soldiers were bored with being stationed in Iceland. So the Canadian military took specific measures to entertain their soldiers and maintain good morale. Both Z-Force and 162 Squadron men played football with Icelandic teams, competed in boxing, and played hockey on the pond in Reykjavik when it was frozen. They bathed in the swimming pools and also practiced equestrian sports. Concerts were also held where Icelandic or foreign bands were brought into play for the airmen. But what both the soldiers and airmen most sought after when it came to entertainment was dancing, drinking alcohol, and meeting Icelandic women, or stúlkas. Unlike the Z-Force soldiers, who mostly met Icelandic women in town because the women were forbidden to go inside the Z-Force camp, the 162 Squadron airmen mostly met women at organized parties at their camp, Camp Maple Leaf. During the time that Z-Force was in Iceland, organized entertainment for soldiers was perhaps once or twice a month. And during the time of 162 Squadron, organized entertainment for the airmen was up to 3 times a week if the movie screenings are not included. Next slide, please. The fact that Z-Force socialized with Icelanders more outside their camp, but 162 Squadron within Camp Maple Leaf is a very interesting development. If put into context with how Icelandic women were covered and judged in the media during the war for interacting with the occupying forces, it is not improbable that Icelandic women would have preferred to attend dances at Camp Maple Leaf in 1944 rather than, for example, socializing with the occupying forces at restaurants or bars where other Icelanders would be. And by attending events, social events within the camp, Icelandic women could perhaps rather escape the judgment of Icelandic society and not have to worry so much about being judged harshly by by just associating themselves with soldiers. But parties at Camp Maple Leaf were very frequent, and Icelanders were almost always invited. Usually women, but sometimes Icelandic men as well. Festive food was often served, and 162 Squadron, for example, brought a chef with them to the country that served all kinds of delicacies that were very difficult to obtain in Iceland, especially during the war years. And a number of parties were held in the commanding officers' mess, where people dressed up in their finest attire and extravagant meals were served. And there were many photographs from Camp Maple Leaf that can be found in archival collections in Canada that give us even more information. If you look at the photo on the slide, it says "Velkomnar" at the top, which means it's just a gendered version of welcome, specifically for women. Next slide, please. So one of the most interesting facts about the presence of 162 Squadron in Iceland is how proportionally many of the airmen were Canadians of Icelandic origin. Many of them were from the Canadian province of Manitoba or Alberta, as you know. Many Icelanders settled in Canada in the early 20th century. The top three names on the slide indicate that they were definitely of Icelandic origin, but the bottom three has been a little bit more difficult to confirm. So if you know any of those three, contact me, please. Next slide, please. But one of the Canadians of Icelandic descent that was in 162 Squadron was Flight Officer Magnus or Mike Gíslason. His parents were Icelandic, but had moved up to Winnipeg before he was born. So he had family in Iceland, and they were quite prominent in Icelandic society. His Icelandic uncles were businessmen and quite prominent in Icelandic theater, so it was a quite upper class family. Mike and his friends in 162 Squadron sometimes would visit his relatives for coffee or cake, and it's not unlikely that his relatives might have attended some of the parties at Camp Maple Leaf in turn. But sadly, Mike Gíslason died in a plane crash over Scotland in late 1944. Next slide, please. There are several cases where a Canadian airman or soldier fathered a child in Iceland, and we mostly know this because the woman later sued for child support, and now those documents are public records. But this topic is still a big taboo in Iceland, and there is still so much stigma around being a child that was born as a result of the occupation. So nobody really still doesn't want to talk about it. Furthermore, the Canadian military was highly reluctant to give the women in question more information on the men, such as their addresses, as some of them turned out to be happily married in Canada, sadly. Next slide, please. Yeah. So what was the main difference between Z-Force and 162 Squadron's time in Iceland? Well, first of all, it was the funding. Z-Force was poorly prepared and ill-equipped and did not even have comfortable sleeping accommodations while in Iceland. Meanwhile, the airmen of 162 Squadron had quite a comfortable accommodations at Camp Maple Leaf and obviously had much more to do in the form of social activities. The Canadian Air Force had and still has much more funding than the Canadian Army. Z-Force soldiers had the most interaction with Icelanders outside their camp, while 162 Squadron invited Icelanders to parties within their camp, away from the prying eyes of Icelandic society. The incidence of STIs among Z-Force soldiers was considered a problem, while the incidence of STIs among 162 Squadron was very low, which indicates that the men of 162 Squadron had access to contraceptives, such as a condom. And because of the family connections of 162 Squadron, with some of the airmen being of Icelandic descent, I think the Canadians interacted with more Icelanders of a higher social standing that Z-Force did in the end. And because of this, in addition to the large amount of money that 162 Squadron had, Icelanders were more willing to interact with 162 Squadron men rather than Z-Force soldiers. And so much changed in Iceland during the war years that perhaps the attitude towards the occupying forces was different in 1940 to 1945. It could be that Icelandic women were less worried about interacting with the occupying forces in 1944 and 45 than in 1940. Next slide, please. I just threw this in here because Madison wrote a paper on this guy. I've been coming into contact with some of the veterans from 162 Squadron, and I met Herb Shannon in the summer of 2023. Yeah, and he died less than a year after I met him. He was still living at home and he was doing really well. But yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, I hope you all have a better idea of what led to the Canadian part in the occupation of Iceland. In my dissertation, I cover these issues in much more detail. There just isn't space for any more here, so I'll save that for next time. But thank you all so much for inviting me here. It's been an absolute pleasure. If you would like to contact me, my email's on the slide. But yeah, thank you so much.
Okay. Well, I'll step in at this point then and like to congratulate and thank both of our presenters for some really fascinating presentations about aspects of the relationship between Canada and Iceland in both World Wars. And looking at the clock and in the interest of giving everybody as much time as possible to ask questions, I think this is the point where we will open things up for questions from our viewers. And I'm looking forward to some interesting discussions. And I have a few questions of my own in case people don't have theirs ready quite yet. Okay, well, why don't we then start off with a question for Madison. So it's an interesting range of material you've obviously been looking at for this research, including the personal papers and everything else. So what source material have you come across so far that's been the most compelling for you?
I would say that reading through the personnel files has certainly been the most compelling because it allows me to get their family histories, their histories prior to enlistment, where they lived, what they did in terms of work, and then their service histories, so their transfers within the Canadian Expeditionary Force, medical histories. Some of these records are up to 200 pages long, so they have like very rich documentation and stories about the soldiers during the war, after the war. So those have been the most compelling that I've worked with thus far.
Okay, great, thank you. We do have a question in the chat if everyone can see it. If not, actually, I'll read it out for everyone just in case not everyone, just in case not all the participants and the viewers can see it. So this is on a related note. It's actually for both of our presenters. Have either of you found any information on Icelandic or Icelandic-Canadian involvement in the Boer War, in the South African War? And Madison, I think you mentioned or alluded briefly to that in your presentation, and I actually made a note to ask about it. So it looks like someone else beat me to it.
I have not looked into this yet. I've been kind of deep in the weeds getting medical histories from soldiers from the First World War, but I have a sticky note on my desk right now to go into records from the South African War as part of the introduction to my dissertation. So not yet, but stay tuned.
Oh, that's great. Okay, since there aren't any other, great. So I think a question then for Karen to actually a bunch of them. So I think the first is, why was it such a stigma for women to interact with the occupying forces? Because it's something that keeps coming up, obviously, as a theme in your presentation.
Yeah, this is something I really didn't have time to like fully get into in this presentation, but this was like considered a form of national crisis. Like it's called Ástandið, or the situation. It's a term used to describe the growing numbers of romantic relationships between the Allied soldiers or airmen and between Icelandic women, and just the Icelanders just generally older generation, and this was like written about in the media as well. It was just considered a huge issue, and yeah, for nationalistic reasons mostly. So yeah, there's that. There's the loss of neutrality, and you're kind of fraternizing with the enemy, like a little bit. That was kind of the view at the time. So yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. I think actually, since we already asked Madison about the sort of sources she found most compelling and most interesting, so what kind of sources, Karen, are you using for a project like this? Obviously, there's a wide range of them, and you mentioned some of them in your last slide, but there's got to be, there will be more to it than that, of course.
Yes. So those are the only kind of secondary sources that are available on this topic, like right now. So I mostly work with primary sources, like in Iceland, I've been looking at police records from the time, and like the war diaries of 162 Squadron and Z Force have just been really helpful as well. And I've been using letters as well, and just photographs is probably my favorite because you can see so much. And you sent me the other day even more photographs from 162 Squadron. It's like 500 pictures, and I feel like pictures sometimes say a lot more than just text. So
yeah, and sometimes what's interesting about pictures is what's not said about what you can see in them.
Exactly.
Exactly. What's just outside the frame? Who took the picture? Where? When? And why? Yes. Oh, and I think we have. Okay, actually, there's a couple more questions in the chat. Okay, so I think there's one for. Okay, great. So actually, thanks for both the presentations. So one for Madison. I'll again read this out for everyone who may be watching and not able to see the chat. So Madison, how are you declaring Icelandic heritage in the attestation papers? There's a fairly, and the question's from Alexander McKinnon, who basically asks, is that men who either gave Iceland as a place of birth or listed next of kin in Iceland? And as a follow-on, have you come across any examples of First World War Icelandic Canadians who were second or third generation immigrants?
Icelandic heritage, yes, some of the men who enlisted were born in Iceland, or there were some who were second generation Icelanders who enlisted. So they had declared that their parents had been born in Iceland and then immigrated to Canada. So all of that information was provided in the attestation papers, that they themselves were either born in Iceland or their parents were and then immigrated.
Okay, great. So I think there will be a follow-on question, actually, again, for Madison. Have you reviewed newspapers? So newspapers, so example, Manitoba Free Press and Winnipeg Tribune for the social research, because this is from Austin G. Wild. He notes that there was a surprising number of sports that the 223rd were involved in, especially boxing.
Yes, so I have a file filled with over 200 newspaper clippings from newspapers.com that I've been going through and compiling notes on about the 223rd Battalion's involvement in various sports and other social engagements. So yes, quite a fair number of newspapers will make their way into my research.
Great. Okay, and then there's actually a question from the same person for Karen. I remember years ago, we chatted, and that's the person asking the question, not me, about how the beer was in Iceland not very strong at the time. And so what role did alcohol imports, types and brands, or lack thereof, play intersocially between Icelanders and Canadian service personnel?
Well, this is quite interesting. So beer was still illegal in Iceland at this time. And like leftovers from the beer, like the alcohol ban and all that. So beer was originally brewed for I think it was the British. No, it was the Americans, I think. They started brewing beer in Iceland because they were like, oh, we don't have any beer because beer is illegal in Iceland. So they just started brewing their own beer, which was called polar beer, and it still exists to this day. You can buy that at Vegas. But yeah, so the Canadians imported alcohol from Canada. So the alcohol they had at Camp Maple Leaf was all like Canadian whiskey and stuff like that. So the airmen would sometimes there were several court martials where the airmen would have been caught stealing bottles of alcohol because they were hard to access in Reykjavik as well.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, having done work on 162 Squadron, that there are numerous mentions in the squadron's operations record book, which, by the way, is digitized and available online as microfilm, to squadron smokers, where they talk about beer having been shipped in from Canada, and they mention it by brand name as well. So obviously, this was important to the people who were there.
Oh, they had Canadian beer. I forgot about that.
I think there's a mention to Black Horse Ale, which I think is, I don't think it's brewed anymore by Keith's, but I think it used to be brewed by by Keith's. So there's a Canadian establishment or a Canadian institution for you. Okay, great. So next question, Tom Benjamin, great subject matter. I'm the son of an English-Icelandic marriage. My father was a member of the British Corps of Royal Engineers, and met my mother in Reykjavik in 1940. They married after the war, and Tom mentions he's been in Victoria, BC for the last 30 years. So, I mean, perhaps not so much a question, but as a comment and a personal connection and relationship to the stories we've been hearing about today. Okay, so next question. I think there's one from Mark, which basically asks whether there was animosity between Z Force and 162 Squadron. Yeah, Sure.
Yeah.
And then there's another follow-on question after that.
Yeah. Not at all, because they were not in Iceland at the same time. Z-Force was there at the beginning of the war in 1940, and 162 Squadron was there at the end, 44 to 45, so they didn't come into contact at all. I don't know if they knew about each other until after. So, yeah, there were some Canadians with the British forces, several, but they had it quite good too. So they didn't have it too bad, I guess.
Okay. Okay, great. Another question in the chat. Okay, yeah, sorry for the broken message. Okay, so the Icelandic government established a committee to study the situation in 1940, and have you included that in your research?
I really don't know exactly what committee are you talking about? The committee just to study the Iceland in 1940. Yes, that is included. I have a whole chapter on the situation and how that all ties into the Canadians and all that. So, yeah, that is definitely something that is included, definitely.
Okay. Great. So I'm just taking a look at the chat to make sure we're not overlooking anyone. Okay, so not overlooking any questions from the audience right now. So I think actually a question for both of our presenters. Might as well start with Madison. How did you come to write about this topic?
It has been a long time coming. So I was working at the New Iceland Heritage Museum in 2015 and found a military helmet in one of the back rooms. And it started actually as a museum exhibit based around this artifact that I'd found. And now it's turned into my PhD dissertation, which was not something that I was necessarily expecting when I started this. But now I'm very happy that it's coming full circle to something that I started as an undergraduate student a decade ago.
Yeah, and for me, this topic just sort of fell into my lap. I was applying to grad school in the US and Canada, and I applied to Queen's, and my current supervisor, he asked me, oh yeah, would you be interested in writing about the Canadian involvement in the occupation of Iceland? I was like, what? I've never heard about that. So it just kind of went from there. And that was my master's topic as well. So I've been working on this for about 6 years now, a little bit longer. But yeah. It's all my supervisor, Dr. Alan English at Queen's.
Okay.
He's amazing. Probably know him.
Yeah. I'll just add yes, and yes, he is, and I'm not saying that just because I'm saying this in public and it's going on the record. He's an amazing person to know and to work with. I'll just add that I got into 162 Squadron literally at the suggestion of my MA advisor, who was Mark Milner at the University of New Brunswick, and found out in the process that there were actually some friends of the family who had been ground crew with 162 Squadron and who'd been in Iceland. So I had the opportunity to meet, long-term family friends who my mother had known growing up. And someone just said, oh, by the way, so-and-so was in Iceland, and got to spend wonderful afternoons talking to them about things like that. And I see we've got another question in the chat. Okay, so this is a fairly specific situational question for Karen. Were there any radical pro-Germanic elements that Z-Force needed to be aware of throughout the entire occupation, or were these elements reduced or managed by the time the Canadians occupied Iceland?
Oh, this is quite interesting. This is a whole thing I didn't have time to get into either. There's Nazi influence in Iceland and just German influence in Iceland before the war and still while it was happening. I guess I have an interesting point of view on that. My great grandma was German, living in Iceland at the time. So yeah, there was definitely like I think I read somewhere that like kids would come up to Canadian soldiers and do like they would like say Nazi things or like do the hand gesture and then the Canadians would be like, but they were just kids. So yeah, there were all kinds of like just prank stuff like that, but I'm not exactly sure. Yeah, there we go. It says here in the comments, there was a small pro-Nazi party in 1939 in Iceland. Yeah, there was definitely Nazi presence in Iceland. I'm just not too familiar about it. Yeah. Mhm.
Okay, and we have just a comment from one of the other viewers. Fascinating material, and thanks for arranging this, of course, and kudos to the presenters. I mean, I'll echo the thanks and the kudos to both of our presenters for talking about really fascinating aspects of the connection between these two countries, which a lot of people will not have known about, or they might not have known all the details about, and which of course also helps situate us in the modern world and the ongoing relationship between Canada and between Iceland. And I think at this point, since there aren't any further questions, although I could keep talking for a long period of time, I'm very good at that. I will like to thank everybody, and then we'll turn things over for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Karen and Madison, for a fantastic discussion and presentations. As Ambassador Hill mentioned in the beginning, there hasn't been very much written on the relationship between Canada and Iceland in the First and Second World War, and now we have the Boer War as well added to this, which is an interesting addition to this. But it is actually amazing to see that there are now two PhD students working on this those two events that need so much more examination and research. I will just point out there were some questions about Nazi involvement in Iceland, and Thor Whitehead, Professor Thor Whitehead in Iceland is a good source of information when it comes to that topic. So if you want to look that up, Thor Whitehead. But just to thank everyone, I would like to mention Ryan Eyfjord, Professor Dr. Ryan Eyfjord, who was instrumental in getting this group together. And I would like to congratulate him and mention that he just received the International Vigdis Prize, an award conferred for outstanding contribution to the world languages and culture, and this was an award ceremony that took place on November 6th, earlier this month. But in general, thank you so much, and we will be posting this online on our website, and we will send it to all the participants. And it has been an honor to serve in Canada this past 4 years plus, and I hope to attend some of those webinars next year, Ambassador Hill. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a great the rest of your day and the week, and for your participation today.